Hello, my name is Joshua Keith, and this is theburningcoal.com, a website dedicated to God's glory, His grace, and our response to it. Today, I would like us to do another Monday motivation, and we're going to be going back to the Beatitudes. And we've had Jesus progressing here. He's been talking about the attitudes we need to have towards Him, towards ourselves, understanding being poor in spirit, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, being merciful. And now, we talked about being merciful a couple of weeks ago. He's going to take it, what I think is a step forward, and talk about us being people that make peace. Notice what he says in Matthew 5:9. He says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." And so we see here that we should be peacemakers. We should be people that are actively seeking peace. Not just trying to avoid conflict, but we need to be pursuing that mindset of peace. And I think it's important that they talk about here being called sons of God, because when we look at the idea of wanting to be sons of God, it really means we need to follow God's example. So what does God's example look like when it comes to the idea of peace? If you remember when we talked about the ideas of mercy, God did not just wait for us to figure out a way to make things right. But instead, God was very proactive. And God went to people and said, here is my message. Here is what the gospel is, so that you have the ability to be saved. Well, we also see that when He brought people into His church, they weren't just made peaceful between them and God, but also between each other. Think about how hard that would have been for Paul when Paul is brought into the church. What God says is, now that I've offered my forgiveness and have made things at peace between me and Paul, even those of you whom he persecuted, you also need to be at peace with Paul. And so when we looked at God's example, we see that He has this mindset of making peace between Him and others, and between the people in His church. And so that's an example that we want to follow. So first of all, we need to be an ambassador for God. As Paul talks about, the gospel is the power of salvation, but how has God chosen to spread His gospel? He chose that gospel through people who serve Him, people who obey Him, through people He's already made peace with. And so what He wants from us is that we are peacemakers on His behalf. He wants us to go out to the world and tell them everything that He's done, all the acts that He's done, so that they can have forgiveness of sins. And so when we look at this idea of trying to be a peacemaker, that necessarily includes the idea of evangelism, that we're trying to make peace between others and God. But also, we need to be going about trying to make peace among other people as well. Now, this is not something that our culture venerates right now. What people tend to do is they tend to find differences, find conflict to make things worse. But we need to follow Paul's advice, where he says, as much as within you, be at peace with all men. And one of the things that's valuable in making peace, one is teaching God's word. Again, when people become right with God, then they have a necessary obligation to become right with each other. But it's also important that we have an attitude of being peacemakers in our conversations with other people. So that means we're not going to be people who are gossips. Either one, promoting gossip, which is the opposite of peacemaking. Now we're causing strife, we're causing trouble. But even the listening to gossip, even allowing it to happen and being okay with it and encouraging those who are inflaming bitter feelings inside themselves, we need to be very careful about that. And when we counsel those people who are having issues with other people, we need to be counseling them not to store that frustration, that anger into bitterness, but instead to be like God and to strive for peace. The words that we say, the attitudes that we have towards other people when they're struggling with other people, those are powerful and they are important. And the example that we set and the words that we say in those situations are the difference between being a peacemaker and one who stirs up strife. And so this week we should focus on who we are being. I hope this lesson blesses you in your walk in His kingdom.